Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society and also the sponsor of this program. Today I want to welcome my co-host, Chuck Mason. We're going to talk about something that we don't talk about very much, and that's obituaries. It's kind of the last formal thing for some of us that people write about, and so we thought it might be interesting to talk about how they're written and what to think about. So welcome, Chuck.
Thank you, Janelle. Obituaries have always had an interest. I've had a fascination for them. And, like you say, it is the last thing generally that gets written about a person. And so with genealogists, it's kind of the last record of family, and you get a lot of information or you get very little. The shortest obituary I ever saw was on the front page of a newspaper, and it said simply, Mrs. Pancoast died yesterday. Now, my Pancoast family down in southern New Jersey is one of those cases that if the family is living in the area, they're all related. They go back to the immigrant who came over in the mid-1680s to Burlington County. But I had no clue. This was in a countywide newspaper, but I had no clue. But I was able to take the information. So I knew it was somewhere within the county. I knew the date that the paper was published, so I knew the date she died. And fortunately, I had death certificates that I could go to.
Yeah.
So it was fairly simple to go find out exactly who she was, where she was, and from there, she wasn't in my direct line, but it was simple.
But it was a Mrs., right? So the last name was not her maiden name.
No. But from the death certificate, I got her maiden name. I knew where she was. I could explore the whole family. And then we have obituaries like I picked out when I first started talking about them out of the Washington Post, where it was about 3/4 of a column down the page. And those are the ones that we just love to find. So one of the things we want to look at when we're looking at an obituary is, what does it say? Analyze it, just like we should analyze any other record. Go through and look at the things that are there. I kind of spread them out and put them on a piece of paper, well, usually in the computer, and then I can take all the facts and play with them and recreate them. And other things we want to look at is what's missing out of the obituary. Do they have a real complete list of family members? Or does it list the surviving spouse and maybe the children? And then, like my grandparents, where it was 28 for one side of the family, and I think it was 23 or 22 grandchildren.
And they listed all of them?
No, they didn't.
Just the number.
So then I had the number. Of course, I knew all my cousins, so I knew who they were counting. But if you don't have that, knowledge, then you at least know you need to look for this many grandchildren.
And if they leave something out, then that begs the question, was it an error or did they do that on purpose? And is there a story there?
Well, and one of the things that often happens because people did not used to plan ahead. I mean, they may have bought cemetery lots, but I don't know when I was growing up, really until I insisted that my parents go to the funeral home and plan their funerals ahead of time. That was not the norm.
Right.
And if somebody is kind of expected to die, then they may have done a little bit of thinking about it. But if somebody is killed, died in an accident or something, bam, you've got all these issues. So it's understandable to understand why things happen. My mother-in-law, when she died, she was in the hospital, expected to live and go home, but kind of died suddenly, you might say. And so at the time we had company, so I did not go down until the day of the viewing. And when I got down there and I looked at the booklet that they had, it listed survivors, it listed grandchildren. There was just my spouse and sister, and a couple of grandchildren and one great-grandchild. And then it said survived also by a sister-in-law. And right away the bell went off because I knew there were 3 sister-in-laws.
Uh-oh.
Well, the sister-in-law that was named was her husband's sister. She had 2 sister-in-laws, her 2 brothers' wives. The brothers were deceased, but
no.
And of course one of those 2 came to the funeral. I didn't hear anything said, but afterward I asked, why did you only list your father's sister? We forgot. So, under stress and things, those things can happen.
Right.
Because you've got a lot to plan in a relatively short time.
Plus, what do you do with blended families? How do you do the stepchildren
and depending on, does everybody get along?
Right.
Is there an issue? When my father had been diagnosed with cancer, and he had been talking. This was in 1997. He had been talking since 1978 about buying cemetery lots when my grandfather died, when his father died, and they hadn't done it. So I kind of pushed that, and then I pushed them to go down to the funeral home and make the arrangements and all ahead of time. And at that point, my father said, why are you push it? I said, because I don't want to deal with my oldest sister in making decisions. You know what she's like. And I said, I want to be able to say, this is what he wanted.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, I thought we were only going to do his, but the funeral director, being very wise, said to my mother, well, let's get something down on paper for you also. Right. And it made it so much easier. When my father died, when my mother died, we went down, we had to pick out the information to go on the cards and the style of the cards and the book, and decide when was the viewing and when was the funeral going to be. But all the major decisions were done. And it was so much less stressful.
Easier, yeah.
So much easier.
I do remember sitting down in a funeral home, and they have like a generic template. And it's mostly just about getting all of the relationships and the names in that, but it doesn't really give you a whole lot of opportunity to do personal things. And that's the really nice thing about the obituaries.
Well, what happened with my dad was in the hospital. He did come home 2 days before he passed away, but he was in the hospital the last month of his life. And when I was up there, I was spending the nights with him. And the one nurse that was on several nights that week, he had gotten to know this guy over the weeks that he was there. And I don't know how they got on the conversation, but my father told him, had the cemetery lots, had all the funeral arrangements made and all. And he turned to me and he said, I guess all you have to do now is write my obituary, unless you've already written that.
Oops.
And I told a little bit of a white lie. I had started to put some things together, but I hadn't formally written it up. But I went home, and over the next couple of days, I wrote it up. And one night I went up, and Dave, the nurse, happened to be on again. So we were talking again, and I pulled it out and I handed it to him. And he said, what's this? And I said, it's your obituary. And I said, anything to add, subtract, whatever. And he went through and didn't change anything. The one thing after the fact that one of my sisters had remembered, My youngest two sisters are twins, and when they were juniors and seniors in high school, they were involved with the band, and my father was involved with the band parents and was actually the president. We hadn't thought about that. I had his work with the fire company. He was the fire chief for a couple of years, the church, Boy Scouts, things like that, but I hadn't thought about that because that actually happened after I was out of the house. And I knew he had done it, but it wasn't as prevalent in my mind.
But it really brings the person to life a little bit when you can talk about the kinds of activities that they were involved in. And for a genealogist, of course, we love that kind of stuff.
Yes. After the obituary was published, I went in the Historical Society up home, and several of the employees, when they saw me, said, "You wrote your father's obituary, didn't you?" And I said, "Why would you say that?" And they said, "Because it's a genealogist's dream." So, putting together, I've done a number of classes on this. I've done it for the two methodology SIGs for both Mount Vernon and Fairfax. I also did it as an education class for Fairfax a couple of years ago. I've done it as a program for both societies. So I put together kind of a guideline of things to consider when you go to write your own obituary. And one of the things that you want to look at or think about is the style or the customs in the area. What's the style of obituaries that the newspaper publishes? Or what are the customs for things that are published in the newspaper? Another thing to consider is it a paid obituary? Where you're paying by the inch, or is it a freebie? When my dad died, they lived close to the border. They lived in Gloucester County, New Jersey, but they lived close to the border of Camden, which each county had its own newspaper. And so people picked sometimes one or the other and sometimes did both. So the Gloucester County paper was the paper we put it in and paid for it. The Camden County paper offered a freebie with the basic information, the fact that the person died, when they died, and the name of the funeral home, and it referred to the funeral home website. And of course, now more and more I'm seeing obituaries on funeral home websites.
Right.
But that can create a problem if that's the only place you put it, because some funeral homes dump them after a period of time.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And others will keep them up forever. Now, Legacy has gotten involved, at least with some of the papers I've seen, so they tend to be out there more or for longer periods of time. So.
Yeah, I think the electronic option is becoming more common too, isn't it?
Yes.
But if you may not be tuned into that site, and then you might miss it altogether. Whereas on a newspaper, you read the newspaper.
I mean, we're so used to going to the microfilm of newspapers to look for them. So, those are a couple of things you want to consider, and then you want to include things like you want to include the person's full name. Did they have any nicknames? Did they use an alias along the way? I have had relatives where certain people know them by one nickname and certain other people know them by another. It's family knows them by one, people they work with knows them by something else. So putting that in, I ran into a couple of times where they put a name in and I wasn't sure whether it was the obituary I was looking for or not. I had to do a little bit of analyzing it. And then, of course, where did they live? Where are they residing at the time that they die? And also, I find it helpful to include former residences. If people moved around,
if they lived a long time in another place.
If they lived a long time and then they retired down south or something, or I have seen cases where they lived in New Jersey, retired down south, and returned to New Jersey. So those kinds of things are helpful. With my parents, they never lived more than a quarter of a mile, or a mile and a quarter rather, from where they were born.
Not very adventurous.
Yeah, unlike me, who I'm up to residence number 11
Oh my
and
gosh.
3 states and the District of Columbia. So also the date and place of birth, that makes it easy. You have it, you know, that's something that we don't necessarily always have. And then I always say list the survivors, and it depends on how extensive you want to make the list, but the surviving spouse, if there is one, the names of the children, and usually you give a location of, you know, the town where they live, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. My grandparents all just listed the number of grandchildren. Well,
Right.
that at least is helpful in research if you don't know the family.
Right,
You know,
right.
because you know you've got 28 or 22 or 23, I forget which it was on my father's side, you know, but you know you've got that many people to look for, and you haven't done a complete job until you've reached the number.
I would think also like a prior spouse. I mean, let's say
Yes.
that you were married to somebody for a long
Long
time
time.
and then they died and now
Yes.
you've got a new spouse. You'd want to
Yes.
maybe include, especially if the children
Right.
were her child.
Right. You know, often, you know, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, you know, stepchildren, you know, nieces and nephews, depending on,
Wow.
you know, how
close they
close you
are,
are. You know, special friends or neighbors. You know, I've often seen where, you know, people have friends for life, and they will be mentioned
Really?
in there.
That's unusual.
You know, it's one of those things that not a whole lot, but I do see them, or, you know, really good friends, or sometimes it's people who were really helpful in the last time the person was ill.
Oh, yes, I've
Especially
seen
if
that.
it's over, you know, a period of time that they have really been helpful in doing things, you know. And of course, before the law changed, domestic partners would be someone else. So anybody that, you know, the family feels they want to include.
I have seen, you know, some gratitude to the nursing staff.
Staff and
so
doctors
They don't
and-
name them
yes.
individually, but they do
Yeah.
put that in, and it's really sweet to have that, I think.
It is. And then also, I like to include family members who have died. You know, in the case of my father was the last surviving child. So in his obituary, we listed my sister who died. I had a sister who was 22 months younger than me that died with cerebral palsy. So we listed her, we listed my father's parents, and we listed all of his siblings.
Wow.
And, you know, I've seen where people will also start to put at least the year the person died. And as a genealogist, I love that because
sure.
I know the year to start looking for
Yeah.
a death certificate. You know, but parents, children, grandchildren, if you've lost them, siblings, you know, anybody else. When my mother passed away, she had one surviving brother. Her brother, youngest brother, survived her.
So I think if you start seeing dates of people who have died that are in that, you're assuming then that that was probably a genealogist or somebody who kept very careful records. Because
yeah.
otherwise, you don't really want them plugging in
things.
You know, approximates.
Yeah. And I've also started to see where people have pets. And they list their pets. Now, I have put together an obituary. I need to update it, and I will probably put 3 pets that they had. You know, occupation and the employer or former employers. You know, if they had a long career, but they changed, you know, they might have worked for one company for a long time, but then moved on to another one. Also, the religious affiliation, the church or churches that they attended if they moved around.
Oh,
Anything
really?
like that, again,
Wow.
is telling you there's records there as a genealogist.
But people only do that, probably, only choose to do that if it's a really meaningful thing. And they're interested in the people who they knew there reading this thing and being mentioned somehow.
Yeah, and of course then clubs and paternal organizations that they may have been involved in. My father was involved with the fire company in the town that I grew up in, and he was fire chief for a couple of years. He was involved with the church, the Methodist church we went to. He was also involved with the Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts that the church sponsored, and we missed one. Was the band parents, the high school. My sisters were involved with the band, and he was the president of the band parents their junior and senior year. And I had let everybody see the obituary beforehand. Wasn't until after the fact that one of my two sisters remembered that. And also he was involved with a model airplane club. So we had all of that. My mother had been involved with Girl Scouts. She had been involved with the church and a women's club in the church. And she had also years ago taught for the county extension service sewing classes. So I had included all of that. So,
well, I think that, in this market here, what you see, usually the big obituaries are military.
Yes.
And they go through the whole military career on that.
Yes.
But it is very interesting to read.
It is to know. I mean, my father's sister's husband was in the military for 27 and a half years, but I don't know all the places that he served. I know a couple of them, but it would be interesting, or would have been interesting, to have that. And of course, if people are immigrants to the United States, it's nice to include that information. Where did they come from? When did they come? When did they become a citizen? And, we all have activities that we like to do. So leisure activities is another thing.
I had one obituary of one of the ancestors that I'm researching. It said that she had lived in the same house for 54 years. I mean, I loved that piece of information.
Yeah. My parents, well, my father didn't quite make 50 years in the house. He was a few months short. My mother did. So, also I sometimes see people who have a favorite travel location or vacation spot. That might be mentioned in there. And of course, then we need to have the necessary things. We need the information on the funeral. When is it going to be held? Where is it going to be held? Is there a viewing, the times and things like that? And of course, where is the body going to be buried? Or if they are cremated and it says they're cremated, my question is, what happened to the ashes? I often
ever talk about that.
They don't. I have had one brother-in-law pass away, and he was cremated, and so my sister has the ashes on the mantle in the living room. But that's
often they're just spread
something you don't know, and so were they put in a cemetery? Were they buried? Were they put in a columbarium? Or so including that can be helpful later down the road to us as genealogists. And then other things might be education. Where did they go to school? Did they go on to college? Did they earn a master's degree or a doctorate degree? And of course, then some other information would be memorial donations. When my parents died, we asked for donations to the church, or my youngest niece is severely handicapped and she was going to a special school. So we also ask either the church or the school for donations there. And one of the other things that working in the flower business on and off most of my life, back in the 70s when I first got into it, there was the big war over flowers at the funeral versus no flowers at the funeral,
really?
and the
Yeah.
please omit. And,
Yeah.
so I happened to see a florist that I know's mother passed away a few years before my father died, and of course, owning a flower shop. And it was very nicely put that flowers would generously be accepted if people wanted to send them. And so I included
Well,
that
it's nice
in
to
there. It's
know
a
that, yeah.
nice way of knowing it. Sometimes I see the funeral home may say something on their website. So, and of course, the other thing with so many funeral homes having a web presence, and sometimes the obituary being a shorter version, and the funeral home having a more extensive version,
Yeah.
the web address of the funeral home is kind of, to me, important
Yeah.
to have on there, because all of this information, it's not mandatory, but it's certainly nice.
Yeah.
It makes obituaries. I often look at the obituary section of the paper on Sunday, and if one is particularly lengthy, I'll just read through it to see what they have actually said in that obituary. So
And how much of it is true?
true. Well, you don't know, but you hope, but by doing it ahead of time, and also sharing it with at least a couple of other family members, you're more likely going to get an accurate obituary.
Well, this has really been interesting, and most people don't go to a professional obituary writer, and so this should be helpful if you're thinking about. I mean, I'm thinking about writing my own, then I don't have to worry about whether somebody gets it mixed up or not. But anyway, Chuck, this has been very interesting, and thank you very much.
Giving you something to think about.
Yeah, I hadn't been thinking about that, even though we've had all the COVID stuff. This is. I want to encourage everybody to go to our website, mvgenealogy.org. We're the Mount Vernon Genealogical Group. We're at 1500 Shenandoah Road. Right now, we are not meeting in person, but we are very hopeful that that's going to start happening, maybe in the fall. Meanwhile, you can.
We are online that people can.
We're online, and we're doing programs by Zoom. So by all means, go online, go to our website, look at the events that we've got, and you are welcome to participate. And thank you again, Chuck. This has been very interesting. I do intend to do mine, because that way I can get in there what I want. And of course, sometimes it's a little PR job too, where you always want to talk about the things that are, the